Hey guys, welcome to the Money Mindset. In a very, very chaotic world like we are today, the one person who brings a lot of wisdom and equanimity into our conversation is Rajiv Thakkar of PPFAS. And he's here with me once again on the show. One of the more popular investors, fund managers, market observers, a student of the market over the last many years, purely because of his approach towards the markets. Rajiv, thank you so much for being with us on the Money Mindset.
Pleasure being here. Thank you, Sonia.
This is such a hard time for everyone, but I want to understand from you how you are navigating all of this because a lot of questions are thrown at you in general about the kind of cash that you're holding in your portfolio despite getting several opportunities in the market. But I want to know, what is the approach right now?
Sure. So, first thing that we tell any investor who comes to us for equity investing is that have a minimum time period of 5 years for your equity investing. Now, all the things that that people worry about on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis, these get evened out over this 5 year period. Now, let us say someone started investing on 1st Jan 2026. Now, if that person is going to stay put till 2031, why does he care about when will the Iran war stop or when will Hormuz open up? Because oil prices will go up, come down in this period. Inflation will be high, low, GDP growth will be high, low, tariff will come, tariff will go away. So, as long as you look at equity investing as owning a part of wonderful businesses and staying put with them for the longer period, most of the worries go away.
So I need to get the elephant in the room out of the way because this is something that a lot of people keep asking you, why you're not deploying in this market and why are you sitting on so much cash. As of the last fact sheet, 20% of your portfolio is still in cash.
19%, yeah, but close,
19%.
yes.
You want to kind of tell us why?
So people get paycheck in first week of the month or whatever. Now that money is for grocery, clothes, shopping, maybe people buy vehicles, buy homes. Does it mean that the day you get your paycheck, you run it down to zero? Answer is no, right? People have a annual spend that they make on clothing, for example. But some people, if you are a stingy person like me, then I would wait for the uh, discount period and I would bulk up. So in that period, I would probably finish my annual clothing purchase in that period. But I wouldn't buy every day or I wouldn't run down my savings account to zero on day one. Same thing goes with equity investing. When upfront I'm saying that equity investing is for a minimum period of 5 years, you wait for the right valuations, right opportunities to come your way. The bank fixed deposit can be for periods as low as 7 days, 14 days, 1 year, 2 year. Equity is an asset class with zero maturity date or infinite maturity date. It uh, does not have a period when the company is going to give you back your money. It's perpetual capital unless they do some buyback down the road. So, in such a long dated asset, why should any investor be in a hurry to purchase it? And it's a significant capital commitment for most people. Let's say if you are buying a vehicle or you are buying a home or you are allocating substantial money to equities, you want to do your research thoroughly. Uh, you want the best features available or all the attributes which are there to your liking. You want the correct purchase price. You don't want to rush into something that you'll end up regretting later.
But is it fair to assume that you're holding 19% cash in your portfolio means you're expecting the markets to correct more before you get better opportunities?
No, not really. So, one of the misconceptions I'll clear right away as far as the month of March is concerned. Uh, at the beginning of March or end Feb, it seemed like we had 20% cash. And at the end of March also, it seems like we have 19-20% cash. But that doesn't mean we did nothing in March, right? So what happens is, if beginning March you have 80 in stock and you have 20 in the bank account, which is cash, and market falls 10%, your 80 goes down to 72, right? So your cash automatically goes up without you having done anything. Now, of that 20, you have to spend a lot of money in terms of buying stock to even bring it back to 20. So, and we did not have any target range in mind saying we want to be 20% end of March or anything like that. We were buying aggressively in March. We have been buying in April as well. So buying is happening. It's just that we don't want to run down the cash just because it's there in the bank account, and we will buy wherever uh, there are opportunities. So in some cases, what happened was our buying was going on. We got partial fills uh, in the purchase orders that were running, and then there were these ceasefire related announcements, etc. So market moved up a bit, and we got partial fills in some of the purchases. But yeah, if not stock A, we could get opportunity in stock B. We will buy whenever there's an opportunity. I have zero idea what market will do in terms of overall index levels, etc. Sometimes opportunities come in individual companies, sometimes opportunities come in a sector, whether rightly, wrongly. One of the private sector bank sold off last month. We felt that it was more sentimental impact, and longer term, it may not impact the prospects of the organization so much. Only time will tell whether that reading is right or wrong. So we were buyers over there. IT services have sold off given the fear around AI and automation that is there. So we have been buyers in that space. The entire market need not crash for us to buy. It could be some sell off in an individual company as well. So one of the power exchanges sold off given the uncertainty around market coupling and all. We were buyers a few months back in that space. So it's not a view on what is happening into geopolitics, whether the index overall will come down or not. It's surely not that.
I want to actually take this one by one. I have many questions on the buying that you've done recently in private sector banks as well as in IT. But before that, I know you don't like to predict which way markets are going. But for someone who, like we were discussing, right, for an average 25 or 26, 27-year-old, he or she has not seen any big bear market. And the global financial crisis was such a long time back that this 25, 27-year-old would have been 7, 8 years old at that point in time. So how should they approach this? Because see, nobody knows if this could be a protracted bear market or a time correction that could last for many, many years.
So the strangest part is that equity, which has no maturity date, it's a perpetual asset class, is an asset which people track minute by minute, second by second. So the moment someone buys a share, she will put it in the app that is there, which gives live quotations. Quantity multiplied by the market price will give you the current realizable value. And if it goes down after your purchase, you get restless. And that up and down creates that thrill or dopamine hit or whatever. Uh, Whereas people will buy jewelry or people will buy gold coins, put it in the locker and pass it generation to generation. People buy their primary residence or even investment properties, not look at it for 30 years. People will buy insurance policies as investments, again for multiple decades. A 25-year-old joining the workforce, if that person retires at 60, will have 35 years of EPFO contributions or NPS contributions. I don't know why people have such a short horizon for equity investing. when I joined the equity markets, timing was such that for almost a decade after that, equity indices went nowhere. So, in 1992, at the peak of the Harshad Mehta boom, and some people would have seen it as a TV series and not lived through it. BSE Sensex was 4,200 or thereabouts. This is 92. 2003, which is after 11 years, Sensex was 2850. So it can be very long. And this is not just one unique example that I've pulled out to make a point. US had a decade where the mainstream indices gave zero returns. 2000 to 2010, there were no returns in the US markets. Japan has had a long period where equity markets did nothing. China, despite being such a fast growing country, so people say, oh, forget about Japan, slow economy, aging population, we are the world's fastest growing large economy, any valuation can be justified, or there's no way that equity cannot give good returns. But China has shown that you can have 3 to 4 decades of very high economic growth, as well as a stock market which gives you barely 1% return per year in dollar terms. So one has to be careful about what one is buying, one has to be careful about the valuation one is paying, and more importantly, time horizon has to be pretty long in equity.
No, 100%. I completely agree with you because for people who have been through many market cycles, they would know. But for people who haven't, they're still in a lot of disbelief, disillusionment. And, there is this growing narrative, and it's picking up a lot on social media as well, that India has now lost its edge when it comes to global investors, right? Global investors, there's a mass exodus of FIIs from India. Foreign investors rather buy into other markets purely because India doesn't have, say, an edge in AI, in deep tech, in large sectors. Also, there is slower growth, there's inflation. What would your argument be to that? Is there a degree of truth to this? I mean, just like honestly, and how does one look into it?
All I'll say is this too shall pass. So there are periods where people coin acronyms, BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These are the countries which will do fabulously well. Then we get clubbed in whatever fragile 4 or fragile 7, and now people will say, oh, we have lost out on AI, etc. In India, we have always been a services economy, or our contribution has been in terms of application of things that other people have invented. Do we have our own operating system? Answer is no. Uh, Microsoft created the operating system. Databases were created by companies like Oracle, or software programs were written by companies like SAP. iOS, Android were created by someone else. Our people were the people who wrote computer programs that use these operating systems, these databases, the mobile systems. Cloud computing, we are not cloud providers. So that is
But
being
that's not a
provided
great
by.
place to be, right? At some point, we need to keep up or at least make an attempt. The argument is that India is not moving out of being a services nation at all into say manufacturing of sectors like AI, deep tech. I mean, now if you count the number of large companies that are doing work, say from an Nvidia to a Palantir, if you look at the market caps, they are as much more than market caps of entire countries. So
So, two small pushbacks on this, Sonia. One is this was always true, it's not a new thing. Now, if you were finding India attractive 5 years back, suddenly today there's no reason to wake up and say, oh, we don't have any innovation here, we are only service people. This was true 5 years back also. Whatever you are saying was true 5 years back, 10 years back. There's no change in that. So that is pushback number one. Number two, it's a journey. It's not a binary. It's not a 0 or 1, or it's not a on-off electric switch. If you read the book Apple in China, uh, over a period of time, uh, outsourcing happened. People in China developed skill sets. Those people changed organizations. Some of them went on to start their own companies. And then the whole ecosystem grew over there, and the innovation mindset and those kind of things happened. So, for example, Apple went over there for to do contract manufacturing, right? The Foxcons of the world set up factories. But somewhere down the road, you had the Xiaomi's of the world coming out of those learnings. So, if you look at the employee base of some of these global multinationals, a lot of them have people of Indian origin on their payroll. Now, earlier these people were sitting in somewhere in California and working for these organizations, but increasingly you have the global capability centers coming here. So, a lot of chip design is happening in India, in Bangalore, Hyderabad, and those kind of places. A lot of outsourced manufacturing is happening here. So, you read about the market share that India has gained in making iPhones here, and the value add is increasing. We are emphasizing domestic defense manufacturing. All these are stories, by the way, of last 12 to 24 months. We were saying make in India and defense is such a great theme. What happened to that? Is defense not a great theme now?
So why is this narrative picked up then?
These things move in cycles. So neither were things as positive as they were being made out 2 years back, neither nor are they as negative as people are perceiving them today.
It's somewhere in between.
It's somewhere in between, and you have to look at reality and remove that either rose tinted glasses or the dust on your glasses, and you have to see reality for what it is.
So a lot of people complain that Indian fund managers wear these rose-tinted glasses and are constantly pushing investments in domestic, funds, etc. While the real opportunity is in global, because India is just 4% of the world GDP as far as the contribution is concerned. So, do you think there's some truth to that argument that a lot of fund managers are just have confirmation bias, basically?
Yes and no. So, this is something that we have been saying for 13 years now, or even longer. So, our mutual fund scheme launched in 2013. From day one, we have had an India Plus Global portfolio. We have Gift City offerings for global investing now. What you are saying is absolutely correct. India is 3 to 4% of global market cap. 96% of market cap is outside of India. And there are wonderful companies out there. And you need to invest in those to reduce country specific risk. At the same time, it's not that India is bad. India is a well diversified market. If you were investing in, let's say, Russia or Saudi Arabia or Brazil, it would largely be natural resources. Or if you are investing in Taiwan, it's largely one company, TSMC. If you are investing in South Korea, it's 2, 3 companies, large companies. Obviously, there are other companies, but most of the market cap is has narrow representation. In India, you have a whole host of companies and sectors. So that way, India by itself is not a bad market. You need to have an India Plus Global portfolio.
Okay. Coming back to the changes that you've made in the portfolio, I was going through the recent fact sheet and you've added some weight to beaten down tech sectors, tech names, whether it's Infosys, HCL Tech. Do you believe that the worst is over in technology, or do you think that AI could further disrupt the tech space?
My base case right now, and maybe time will prove me either right or wrong, so we don't know what the answer is. My current hypothesis is that AI improves the productivity by a large amount for software developers, but it does not take away the need for people to implement these things. There have to be people who have domain knowledge, who will give the correct prompts, who will fine tune the output, who will work with the AI tools to debug, uh, maintain these things, carry out improvements over time. And what happens is whenever something becomes cheap, the demand simply explodes. Let me give you an example. Stock brokerage rates used to be 2% way back in the uh, ring days, where Open Outcry and BSE had this ring where people would go and scream at each other to do transactions. Today, maybe you pay 20 rupees per trade, or sometimes even zero. You just pay the demat charges, etc. But the volume has exploded. And today, single stock brokerage companies have market caps of 1 lakh crore plus, and there are quite a few of them. So, as compared to 30, 40 years back, rates have collapsed, total revenue and profitability has
Gone up.
increased. This is not one isolated example. You can look at cell phones, for example. Started with 16 rupees a minute. Uh, SMS would be 1 rupee or 2 rupees, whatever. And there was no data, no 2G, no 3G, no 5G. Today, there's a flat uh, amount that you pay to the cell phone company, and you can have as many calls as you want, liberal data limits. The pricing today is the same or lower than what it was. So the ARPU today would be whatever, 200 to 50 rupees. And when the cell phones were launched in mid 90s, people were paying 600, 700 or 1000 rupees per phone connection. Uh, and if you were a heavy user, even more. So when pricing came down, the volume simply exploded. So when AI is bringing productivity to IT services, people will find more and more use cases uh, to implement a lot of things that couldn't be implemented because of cost considerations or because of long timelines. A lot of those projects will start coming up. And like just yesterday, uh, there was this big thing about Anthropic releasing
Yeah. Mythos.
releasing Mythos, and it started finding vulnerabilities all across. Now, what happens when vulnerability is found? Does it not increase the work of the data security people all across the world to make sure that all those things get patched? Now, it's a work that did not exist till 1 week back. Now, suddenly everyone is scrambling to patch up all their operating systems, browsers, applications. Does that not create more work?
Fair point. It, of course, creates more work, but I think there's a two-part question in this. One, will IT stocks outperform the market? Because that is something that IT has not done. So even if the worst is over, right? The second question is the worst over for tech stocks? And even if the worst is over for tech stocks, given so many changes with AI and the fact that it's taking away jobs and, whatever, disrupting companies, etc., will it be able to give disproportionate gains compared to the market?
So let us say, again, I don't know what is your threshold level, but let me just put a random number. Let's say someone approached you with a good career offer, a salary of 5 crores a month. Would you take that? Probably yes, right? So 60 crores a year sounds a pretty reasonable salary. You think it's attractive enough, you evaluate it, you find out what work will require to be done and all that, and you sign up. But is there a guarantee that you will be the richest person, someone else will not get a 10 crore per month salary? No, you don't know what other things will do. So, is someone creating a Nvidia in India right now, which will beat all these IT services companies and will. So, see, a priori, I don't know which companies will beat the index. All that I can do is I stay away from things which I feel will destroy wealth on an absolute basis, or which will find it difficult to even beat bank FDs. And I go and buy things which look reasonably attractive from the medium to long term. Now, will my scheme be the number one performing fund all in all India and all over the world basis? I don't know. Most likely not, because probability is against it. There are so many people competing for that. So, uh, do IT services look reasonably okay at this time? They do to me. Will it? What else will do well? I have no idea.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. So that's on IT services. The other space that you've been aggressively buying into is private sector banks. And we just briefly spoke about HDFC Bank. But I want to understand the thesis over there, because HDFC Bank, if you look at the stock, it's down 20% in the past 6 months. Looks highly attractive from a long term standpoint. But I want to understand, what is your thesis on why you're bullish on private sector banks in general? And do you think the worst could be over?
So, a lot of people are, let's say, bullish on housing. A lot of people are bullish on, let's say, auto. People say so much of infrastructure will get created in India, or um, we are encouraging small and medium enterprises. Now, whether on the personal front, auto loans, mortgage loans, cards, uh, mutual funds, stock brokerage, life insurance, general insurance, all this cannot grow without the bank parentage. And these banking groups have presence in all of these activities through their subsidiaries or directly. So they are present in credit cards, debit cards, they are present in forex remittances, they are present in uh, asset management, general insurance, life insurance, all of these things. I don't think you can have GDP growth without the banking sector growth. People talk about mutual funds and disintermediation of banks, etc. Fixed income disintermediation only happens for AAA names. Uh, Liquid funds can take money from general public or corporates and buy uh, NTPC or NHB or NABARD, those kind of names, and disintermediate. But after the bankruptcy of Island FS, after troubles in DHFL, ADAC Group, SL Group, now there's no market even for AA paper after the problems in the mutual fund, in the credit risk funds around COVID. Now there's no market for lower rated paper. So disintermediation of banks will not happen. A person going to the bank gets the DICGC cover, the government guarantee of 5 lakh rupees will be secure. Even if the bank goes bust, you are protected for 5 lakh rupees. So people have that trust in the banking system. Banks will be lenders to a whole host of sectors. NBFCs can go only so far. So there will be some niche commercial vehicle finance company or some gold loan company. But I don't think banking sector can be whisked away. And between private and public, is the worst over? Or so what has happened is public sector banks have gotten aggressive in lending to retail. So they have been bringing down pricing, and the uh, erstwhile market leaders in that space, the private sector players, are not willing to work below a certain price, which I think is very rational. One should not misprice risk. Uh, you have to account for credit losses and through a cycle, not only in the first 6 months, 12 months. I think those will mean revert in terms of the service standards, in terms of the public perception. I think mainly these banks have been gaining market share. So let's see.
Was the decision also based on valuations? Because if you look at valuations now, price to book of HDFC Bank is 2 times. The 10-year average, I think, is about 3.8 times. Even Kotak, right? Price to book is around 2.2 times. So most of these banks are trading much cheaper than their 10-year average. Was that a big decision-making
Valuation is a
factor?
big factor. Balance sheets are also clean. I think the only thing that people are not liking is that the reported growth numbers are not looking that great. But those things go through cycles. You will not have a situation where banking sector does not grow and economy grows. That doesn't happen.
Okay, one final question on specific sectors, and then we'll move on to the overall markets again. I noticed that you're big on the energy transition theme as well. You've accumulated names like Mahanagar Gas, IGL. Tell us a little bit about that hypothesis.
So, partly the city gas distribution companies uh, are in a space where they are less polluting as compared to, let's say, diesel. Government has been encouraging it. Uh, there has been a sell-off around the geopolitical situation and where LNG uh, is in short supply, but the government has made sure that at least CNG for vehicles and piped gas for homes, uh, that supply is kept intact. And in fact, given the situation around LPG, the government has announced measures that there will be quicker uh, permissions for laying down pipelines. They are encouraging people to shift from LPG to piped natural gas. So, as such, these should see some increase in volume down the road. And valuations again have been reasonably cheap in these companies.
So, like energy transition, are there any big themes that you're watching out for over the next 1 to 2 years where perhaps you've not deployed yet, but you're still, very bullish on?
So themes are very easy to identify. You just have to look out of your window or look at the headlines and you will figure what the themes are. That does not automatically make money for you. So if you were an investor in 90s, the big themes were private sector airlines, where the Indian Airlines was the sole aircraft operator in India, and you had all these jet airway kind of companies coming in. So you had Air Deccan, Air Sahara, Modi Luft, all these companies coming in, NEPC Airlines. All of them went bankrupt. Not a single one of that era survives. Cell phone companies were allowed to start operations. Most lost money for investors. So that automatically does not generate investor returns. You need some pricing power, you need balance sheet strength, uh,
Some moat.
you need some moat. Valuation should be reasonable when you purchase it. So, let's say, again, no buy, sell, hold recommendation, but Future Group and Avenue Supermart both are in organized retail. One lost money for investors, one made money for investors. So, one has to be selective. So, themes are well known. So, organized retail has been a long standing theme. Now, layered on top of that, there's the quick commerce theme and food delivery theme, domestic manufacturing across a whole host of sectors, people who are getting PLI benefits, all those are beneficiaries, defense manufacturing locally, energy transition, all these are themes. But within that theme, you have to convert that to an actionable idea, an individual company which is investable. That's the challenging
And
part.
a lot of these sectors, it's like a winner takes all kind of situation, also, eventually, right? There's like, it ends up becoming a duopoly, as we had discussed in the past as well, like with quick commerce, for example.
Yeah, so sometimes you may not directly buy a theme, or you may buy something which is an ancillary to that thing. So, for example, in the growth of stockbrokers, discount brokers, uh, depositories were beneficiaries of that theme. And you have only two depositories, whereas technically there can be 200 discount brokers. There's no limit on number of discount brokers that can be there, but the nature of business is such that you probably will not have 200 depositories. So you could choose a less competitive space within a theme, something which has pricing power or operating leverage in terms of unit economics becoming better as more and more volume comes in.
Mm. Okay, now coming to the behavioral part, right? Because there is so much to learn from you on how to have a winner's mindset. Because I mean, it's for a reason that in a country of over a billion people, there are barely maybe 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 really successful investors. So, what are the two or three mindset changes or behavioral patterns one needs to have to become a successful investor? Some traits.
So again, to quote Charlie Munger and Buffett, they said that uh, so in Christianity or in Judaism, there are these 7 deadly sins. So they said in most sins, the long term consequences are bad, but while you are committing them, it's a lot of fun. So, like if we ordered a lot of food and just gouged ourselves, that would be gluttony. Uh, we'll probably become obese down the road or something. But while you are indulging in that, that's giving a lot of pleasure. They say that there's only one sin which, while you are committing itself, you are miserable. So there's no upside to it, there's only downside, and which is envy. Uh, now, if you can get rid of this, uh, automatically it makes you a better investor. If you don't care about how rich your neighbor has got by buying the hottest thing going around, most of the problems are solved. So the biggest mistakes get made when you rush in to buy a asset class, or when you rush in to buy a particular theme or a stock after it has gone up significantly just because someone else has made money. I think if you can avoid that, most of the problems get solved. Second thing is, if you understand your own risk appetite, your own risk taking capacity, and then you give the appropriate time to those asset classes, again, that goes a long way. Uh, Biggest problem with equity investing is people get forced out of it involuntarily. Uh, if you are buying shares on margin, or if you are doing futures and options and you get a margin call which you can't pay, it will be forced liquidation. If people have not kept adequate emergency surplus, uh, typically job losses and market crashes come together. Now, someone who did not have a emergency corpus and COVID hit, and unfortunately, if that person's company was shedding jobs, and this person would have had to exit equity investments at the bottom of the market. So, as long as you can avoid these big mistakes, people should be fine. Uh,
That's a bit of a slippery slope. I'll tell you why. Because I mean, I speak to a lot of retail investors, and when you're a when you're in the media, when you're a public figure, you get a lot of brickbats as well, as you would know. A lot of people tell me that it's very easy for you to say because you have a corpus and you have been in this market for so many years. But for people who are, say, just starting afresh, who have seen losses, who are still dealing with job issues, market is not growing, it's not easy for them to kind of imbibe these qualities of patience, resilience, waiting, playing the waiting game. What would your advice be to them?
if you are dependent on coming to the stock market to get your starting capital, 99.9% of people will fail. I have immense amount of respect for Mr. Rakesh Jhunjhunwala, but people take precisely the wrong lesson from his life. Uh, People think that he talks about this. I came to the city with nothing in my pocket, no inheritance, and everything I built here. So people think in the first 10 years we'll speculate, and then we will create a big corpus, and then we'll buy the next Titan and we'll become billionaires. That's typically not the way things work. Your corpus comes from your profession or from your job, monthly savings, which you have to compound. If you say, I'll come to the stock market, the only money that I have is to open a demat account, and then the market has to give me all the returns, it doesn't work that way.
So, what are the biggest mistakes you think investors make during volatile times?
Volatile or non volatile, people come with very unreasonable return expectations. uh, if the stock market is going to generate, let's say hypothetically, India will grow, let us say 6% and let us say 4% inflation, 10% nominal growth, or 12% nominal growth, whatever your base number is. Equity indices will give that much return at an aggregate level. Now, if market is giving 12 and if you generate 16, then I will probably earn 8. But when you average out, it will ultimately come to that 12. Now, there are people who have spent decades researching the market, who have servers located in exchange premises by co-location, who use huge amount of computing power to uh, analyze the news feed coming in and immediately have automated trading. There are people who employ sector specialists and analysts who cover various companies. Now, if you are a retail investor, you just open a demat account and you think equity market index level is giving 12% and I should somehow, just because I've come here, generate 20%. It doesn't work that way. I think that's the biggest mistake. If you are okay with getting market returns, you can simply go and buy a Nifty index fund, keep putting money every month, and it will compound over a period of time. To earn more than 12%, it requires skill set, it requires interest, and it requires time. All three are required. You cannot say I'll spend half an hour in a week just reading newspapers or watching financial TV, and that alone will give me more than market returns.
Fair, fair. And I take your point on envy because I'll tell you, I come from a school of thought where I learned that you buy and you hold. Like, for example, with the PPFAS FlexiCap fund, I've been an investor for many, many years. Disclaimer there. I haven't sold any of my units, right? And it's worked for me. But today, when you wake up, there are people who say that the world order is changing so fast. There's AI, there's disruption. This buy and hold theory doesn't work anymore. Do you agree with that? And then it's kind of confusing for an average retail investor on when do you sell, when do you exit?
So, in this room, there are three people. Let's say you are there, I am there, and the camera person is there, right? Let us say you are investing in the market in an index fund and you are a buy and hold. You will, by definition, get what the index will get.
12-14% over long term.
Yes. Now, let us say I subscribe to this theory that world is changing very fast and AI and geopolitics and all that. And I and the camera person, two of us decide that we will not be buy and hold investors. We will keep buying, selling all the time. Now, two of us are the entire market. If I am selling, he'll be buying. If he is selling, I'll be buying. Our aggregate return before costs and taxes will be the same as the returns that you are making. If I get a call right, he will get it wrong. If he gets it right, I'll get it wrong. Aggregate, we will end up paying brokerage, we'll end up paying STT, and we'll end up paying short-term and long-term capital gains. If world is changing and you are going to sell, let us say you are right, but there is some fool at the other end who's buying from you. If everyone is a seller, there's no buyer. The very nature of the market is there is a buyer and there is a seller. The aggregate returns will be market returns. That's mathematics. All the investors put together cannot earn more than what the market earns. It's like if two of us pull out a pack of cards and we start gambling. If you win, I have to lose. Money will not get created out of thin air. No matter how fast you churn, that churn will result in STT, brokerage, and short-term, long-term capital gains.
So
That's
you
all.
subscribe to the buy and hold theory even
For
now.
most people, there will be some smart people. Now, there will be some expert card player who's
Spending
spent
all his time doing the
20 years
research.
doing this. That
Yeah.
person will take advantage of everyone else on the table and will win most games. Now, for that person, maybe it makes sense. But for 99% of the people, it's a foolish endeavor. The problem is everyone thinks that they are in that 1%.
Yeah. Or they can be.
Or they
Eventually,
can
they
be.
can be. Yeah, I remember when I started this podcast a year and a half ago, Ramesh Zamani had told me that, you can create wealth in mutual funds, but real disproportionate generational wealth you can only make in stocks. And I went back home with that thought and I felt a lot of FOMO because I was like, I can't do this full time. I can't sit and research stock full time. I'm not a fund manager. I'm a journalist. This is what I do, right? But I felt, oh, maybe I should take some time out. And but over the years I've learned that I just get peaceful sleep by putting my money in mutual funds or in a PMS or whatever it is, right?
That's the problem with Mr. Ramesh Damani. He makes it sound so simple. Listening to him, people think it's very easy, but he's one of a kind, right? Even I like, let's say, listening to Arijit Singh, but I can't make that effort outside of the bathroom. Like, I'll get beaten up.
No, fair enough. But yeah, I mean, I take your point. I mean, and he as well feels that FOMO that, oh, if I'm sitting with 1,000 crores, there are my peers who have made 10,000 crores and 20,000 crores. So if he is someone who's going through envy, then who am I to, even get into that race, right? That's how I consoled myself eventually and just
Yeah,
stuck to
even
mutual
I
funds.
console myself, yes.
So you have all your investments in mutual funds itself?
Yes, mutual funds and the stock of our own company. I don't have any listed equity.
So, in terms of, because you have a lot of international exposure as well through your funds, through Gift City as well, if someone has 100 rupees today, what should the breakup be between international exposure as well as domestic?
International, like, with mutual funds hitting their limit of $7 billion, and this was hit somewhere in 2022, 4 years back. Incrementally, mutual funds cannot give you international exposure in a meaningful way. So people have to use the LRS route to either buy global funds or buy funds from Gift City. That comes with its own challenges in terms of doing paperwork. There are some losses on account of remittance charges that banks impose, which can be pretty steep. So from that point of view, given the friction, uh, it cannot be very meaningful, but I think most people should have a minimum of 20-25% allocation to global stocks.
Now it's also easier to do through a lot of platforms are there where you can buy directly into some of these S&P 500 ETFs, etc. Right?
So you have platforms, but when you convert rupees to dollars, you still have to go to your banker. And even if it is an online process, people will charge 2 to 3% each way. So it cannot be used to uh, transfer money, quickly get it out, again transfer. So each transaction will cost you 3% as compared to uh, close to zero in domestic investing.
Hmm. Okay. Some final thoughts, and I want to come back to the first question I asked you about keeping 19% cash in the portfolio. And I'm sure it's not an easy decision because a lot of people must be coming at you saying, you know what, this market has fallen. Why don't you deploy, etc. Why are you sitting with cash? If my money has to sit in cash in your fund, I'd rather just put it in an FD, etc., etc. How do you deal with that collective noise and take the path less trodden?
So the communication to investors has been clear from day one, from 2013. So right now 19% is there. This is not the highest. We have been as high as 30%. This was in late 2017, early 2018 kind of thing. And this we have said and communicated clearly to people in the past as well. I think most people who make noise are not even unit holders. So we have 60 lakh customers and maybe 5-10 crore people in India obsess about our cash levels. Like, why do they care? Only people who have invested with us should care. And to those people, we have communicated that this will be the stance that we will take. If someone has invested with us in past 2 years, and let us say we have been 20% in cash, that cash has generated, let's say 7 and 7% for 2 years. Let's say it's generated 14-15%. Compare that with Nifty or Sensex. Those have been flat or slightly down, slightly up. So, being in a hurry has not worked in the last 2 years. Now, uh, from the bottom, it may have gone up 4-5% or whatever, but those kind of moves keep happening. And as I said, in March itself, we've bought stuff in a meaningful way. In the first 10 days of April, we are talking on the 10th. We have been buyers in the market, so it will get deployed.
Okay. So you plan to keep it at this level or deploy it through
There's
the
no
year?
plan. It depends on the opportunities which come our way. So if I get the right security at the right price today, I will bring the cash level down to zero right now.
Okay. Final thoughts. I remember, I mean, the first person who actually introduced this concept of equanimity to me was you, and I try to use it a lot, even in my daily life, not just in my investing career. So thank you for that. But and this is something that all the books, all the scriptures, whether the Gita, you talk about Krishnamurti, you talk about all the spiritual gurus teach you equanimity. But in today's day and age, where there's so much external noise, it becomes harder to kind of implement, especially for the younger generation. So what would your advice be to them?
First thing is stop stimuli coming in. So I think people who do meditation practice, or there are these retreats. So the Vipassana retreat, for example, is a 10-11 day retreat where you don't have access to newspapers, TV channels, cell phone. That very act of not checking what the news is right now or what is happening in the world, notification not being there, that itself calms down the mind. So people who are fully into anxiety, etc., just reducing the uh, number of hours one is connected brings down that anxiety level, brings a certain amount of calm. So we have been conversing for almost an hour now. In this hour, we haven't checked what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this 1 hour is peaceful, right? If we are doom scrolling all the time, then that anxiety will be there.
It's almost like meditation, right? Because you are in the moment and you're not kind of thinking about anything else, because you can't. You are in conversation with someone.
So simple things, closing the eyes, focusing on breathing, not looking at the screen. Simple things go a long way, and people who are serious about this should consider meditation retreats, something like a Vipassana.
Have you done Vipassana?
Yes.
Multiple times or just like once?
Uh, I've done the longer retreat just once, but practice is there. Not as regular as one would want, but I do practice meditation.
A lot of market people do Vipassana actually, I guess, just to manage the stress.
Yes. Manish Chokhani, Mr. Vallabh Bansali, Durgesh Bhai, who introduced us. Our founder, Parag Bhai, was a practitioner. So, a lot of people are there.
I hope to do it someday, but I just talk too much at the moment. So I need to first reduce that, and then I can go and completely be silent. So that is my
He
problem.
spoke about Mr. Ramesh Damani. He was talking about one very successful investor, and he spoke about that investor by this modified movie title. He said, "Do aankhein, 12 kaan." So the movie title is "Do aankhein, 12 haath." But he said, "Do aankhein, 12 kaan." So this person sees and listens to what other people are saying, does not open his mouth at all, and keeps his thoughts to himself. So being a better listener has made him a great investor.
Who is this?
It was a private conversation, so
Okay,
I'll not
okay.
want to name the person, but basically he was trying to explain the importance of listening.
Okay. Very quickly before we end, quick rapid fire, just 5 or 6 questions that I ask a lot of my guests. First one is buy, sell, or hold. What is your recommendation today?
Selectively buy.
Selectively buy. If you have 1 lakh rupees, where would you put it? Equity, gold, or keep it in an FD?
Equity heavy, but some fixed income as well.
Sector of the next 1 year?
Difficult to say, but I think our largest investments are in private sector banks.
Do you see a further fall in gold and silver after the 20% drop from the peak?
No idea whatsoever.
Any book recommendations, any podcasts, something that you're reading these days?
We spoke about equanimity. I think something like Deep Work by Cal Newport would be interesting to implement.
Deep work.
Yes.
Okay. Uh, any asset class that will give you disproportionate gains over the next 3 to 5 years?
I think I'm not sure about disproportionate, but in terms of predictability, I think people should look at REITs and InvITs.
Oh, interesting. I did not expect you to say that. I thought you would say equities, but okay, REITs and InvITs. Okay, great. And finally, one lesson that you constantly remind yourself from any mentor that you've heard from or you've spoken to recently.
Multiple ones. So, one obviously is the impermanent nature of things. So, not to get too perturbed when things are bad and not to get too euphoric when things are going good. And the other thing is, we've spoken so much about cash, the option value of cash. So, if there's some money in the bank account that allows you to buy any unspecified asset at an unspecified time, at an unspecified price. But you can avail of that opportunity only if you have money and liquid enough money. Uh, if you have zero bank balance and market crashes 50%, you can not do anything with it.
So it's good to always keep some cash.
So there are times when you should be fully deployed, but at other times when opportunities are not there, don't force yourself to deploy.
Okay, Rajiv, it was such a pleasure speaking to you, as it always is. A mix of markets, behavior, emotional investing, how to stay away from, volatility, or how to ride volatility. But thank you so much, as always, for being on the Money Mindset.
Thank you for the opportunity, Sonia. Thanks.